She called his childhood nanny a charity case. What happened next? Let's just say it's a moment she never forget. The Holloway estate wasn't just a house, it was a statement. A sprawling masterpiece of wealth and history. The kind of place that made passers-by slow down, their eyes lingering on the towering white columns and the endless circular driveway that seemed to stretch into another tax bracket. Inside, chandeliers glittered like captured stardust, every detail curated with the precision of someone who knew that appearances were everything. Eleanor Holloway had built her world around that belief. Tonight was her crowning event, the annual Holloway Foundation Gala, an affair where only the elite of Houston's high society secured an invitation. A decade in the making, each year more extravagant than the last. Draped in a sapphire blue silk gown, diamonds shimmering at her throat and ears, Eleanor moved through the grand hall like royalty. The whispers of admiration, the envious glances, she drank them in as if they were her birthright. But tonight, something was about to happen. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor Holloway would learn what it felt like to be on the wrong side of power. Then, she spotted her husband. James Holloway, the oil magnate turned investor, stood near the grand entrance, posture straight, but with an uncharacteristically gentle look on his face. And in front of him, an elderly black woman. Small in stature, but standing with quiet confidence. And just like that, Eleanor's smile faded. She wasn't a guest, not one of their kind. Eleanor narrowed her eyes. She took a step closer, just enough to hear. "Miss Ruth," James said, his voice warm, his smile easy. "You made it." The older woman nodded, her eyes bright with something deeper than happiness, pride. "Maybe. Course I did, sugar. Wouldn't miss it for the world, sugar." Eleanor's fingers tightened around the delicate clutch in her hand. Who was this woman? A passing server stopped beside her, offering a flute of champagne. She accepted it automatically but didn't drink. James was hugging the woman now, not the polite, distant embrace he gave acquaintances, but something softer, familiar, intimate, like she mattered. The sharp sound of Eleanor's heels echoed against the polished floors as she stepped forward. "James," she said, her voice smooth, practiced, but carrying just enough of an edge, "aren't you going to introduce us?" James turned, still smiling, but something flickered in his eyes. He knew that tone. "Of course," he said. "Eleanor, this is Miss Ruth. She practically raised me." Eleanor's perfectly painted lips curved, but inside, something twisted. "Raised him?" Miss Ruth chuckled, her voice like an old jazz record, aged, but still full of soul. "Oh, I didn't do much. Just made sure he ate right, stayed out of trouble, and learned the difference between right and wrong." Eleanor tilted her head, the smile never reaching her eyes. "Well, isn't that sweet? I just wasn't aware we were inviting staff." The room didn't go silent, but the shift was there. The kind of subtle, lingering pause that only the truly socially aware could catch. The kind of tension that draped itself over a conversation like a silk sheet, light enough to be ignored, heavy enough to be felt. James' smile faded, just slightly. "Miss Ruth isn't staff." Eleanor took a slow sip of her champagne, her expression innocent. "Oh," she murmured, "then what is she?" Miss Ruth didn't flinch. She had known women like Eleanor before, polished, well-bred, but fragile when tested. "I'm family," she said simply. Eleanor let out a soft, lilting laugh. Almost too light, too airy. "Well, isn't that something?" She turned to James, her voice still wrapped in silk but just a touch too loud. Miss Ruth said nothing. James said nothing. But something in the air shifted, something Eleanor wasn't prepared for. A delicate clink of silver against glass rang through the room. A few guests glanced their way, sensing the tension. Most pretended not to hear, swirling their wine, their smiles frozen in place. But the moment had landed. Eleanor had made sure of that. James' jaw tightened. He never cared for public scenes. But something about the way she said it, the casual cruelty, the entitlement, stirred something deep in his chest. He turned to Miss Ruth, his expression unreadable. "You hear that, Miss Ruth?" His voice was calm, but there was a razor's edge beneath it. "My wife thinks you're a charity case." Miss Ruth exhaled softly, not in offense, not in sadness, in understanding. She had seen this before, not in this exact ballroom, not in this exact dress, but she knew women like Eleanor, the ones who confused wealth with worth. She smiled gently. "Oh, sugar," she said, shaking her head. "I've been called worse." That should have been the moment Eleanor backed down. That should have been her cue to read the room, to notice the way James squared his shoulders, the way some guests subtly leaned in, their attention shifting from their five-figure bottles of champagne to the scene unfolding before them. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned in. "Well," she murmured, tilting her glass, watching the golden liquid swirl, "I just think it's so admirable how some people cling to the past. I mean, James was what, a child when you—" She waved a manicured hand. "Worked for his family. That was decades ago. And yet, here you are." She gave a small, amused shake of her head. "It's sweet, really. Holding on like that." Miss Ruth smiled. But not the kind Eleanor was used to. It wasn't polite. It wasn't obliging. It was knowing. "Oh, honey," Miss Ruth said, voice steady, unshaken. "You think I'm the one holding on." Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around the stem of her glass. "I just mean, you don't mean anything," James cut in, his voice low, controlled. And just like that, the entire room shifted. Eleanor turned sharply toward him, eyebrows arching ever so slightly. "Excuse me," James' gaze didn't waver. "You assume you know me, know what matters to me, know who I value. But let me ask you something, Eleanor." He stepped closer now. "When's the last time you actually listened to me?" A hush fell over the small circle of guests nearby. This wasn't just a passing remark anymore. This was something else, something real. Eleanor forced a light laugh. "Oh, come on, James, don't be dramatic. It was just an observation." "No," he said, shaking his head. "It wasn't." For the first time that evening, Eleanor felt something unfamiliar knot in her stomach. It wasn't embarrassment. She was used to attention. It wasn't discomfort. She thrived in sharp conversations. It was something worse. It was the feeling of losing control. And James wasn't done. "You see, the thing about Miss Ruth," he continued, stepping even closer, his voice carrying now, "is that she didn't work for my family." He exhaled. "She raised me. She was there when my parents weren't. She made sure I had food when they were out closing deals. She was the one who stayed up when I had nightmares. She was the one who—" He stopped, just for a second. Just long enough for the weight of it to settle. Then, softer. "She was the one who loved me." Eleanor's lips parted slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. James turned to Miss Ruth now, his voice gentler. "And she's never asked me for anything." A heavy silence, and then Eleanor did the only thing she knew how to do. She scoffed. "Oh, please," she said, rolling her eyes, her tone laced with mockery. "Don't tell me you're actually falling for this. You're a grown man, James. You don't need a nanny anymore." James turned fully to her now. And the way he looked at her, it wasn't anger. It wasn't even disappointment. It was clarity. "I don't need a nanny," he agreed, nodding slightly. "But I do need people in my life who actually care about me." Eleanor blinked. For the first time, she felt the weight of the room shifting. Guests weren't just watching anymore. They were judging. Whispers drifted through the crowd like ripples in water. "Did you hear what she said? She called her a charity case right in front of him. Oh, this is not going to end well for her." Eleanor turned, scanning the room for an ally. But the faces around her, all the ones who had smiled at her just an hour ago, laughing at her jokes, basking in her presence, were different now, blank, neutral at best, distant at worst. Her grip on the champagne glass tightened, though now it felt less like a symbol of power and more like a prop she didn't know what to do with. James was her husband. He would get over this. They would go home, and he would. And she would find a way to turn this around, wouldn't he? She forced a smile, placing a careful hand on his arm. "Darling," she said, her voice softer now, coaxing. "Let's not make a scene." James looked down at her hand. Then, very deliberately, he stepped back, and in that moment, Eleanor realized She had already lost, but the night was far from over, and James wasn't done shocking her yet. A hush settled over the room. The kind of silence that only happens when something real is unfolding. Eleanor could feel it now slipping. Her control, her carefully curated image, the security of being his wife, the champagne in her hand suddenly tasted bitter. James exhaled slowly, running a hand over his jaw before stepping forward. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud, but it carried. "You know, Eleanor, there's something I've never really told you." His gaze was steady, unwavering, something I never thought I'd need to tell you. Eleanor forced another light laugh, the kind meant to smooth things over. "James, let's not turn this into some," but he didn't stop. "You've always loved telling people I'm self-made, that I built my company from the ground up, that I pulled myself up, worked hard, made smart choices." His voice tightened just slightly. "But do you know who made that possible?" Eleanor blinked. "Well, you did, obviously." James shook his head, cutting her off. "No, she did." James turned toward Miss Ruth. His expression was raw in a way Eleanor had never seen before. "She's the reason I even had a chance." Miss Ruth opened her mouth, but James gently held up a hand. His voice was thick. "No, Miss Ruth, let me say this." The guests weren't pretending anymore. They weren't swirling their drinks. They weren't murmuring polite conversation. They were watching, absorbing every word. James turned back to Eleanor. "You love throwing these galas, donating to charities, making speeches about giving back." His eyes darkened. "But the real charity happened in houses like the one I grew up in." Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "James, this is really not the time." "It is the time." He took a step closer. "You want to talk about the past? Let's talk about it. About how my parents were too busy building their empire to raise their own son. About how I had to schedule time just to see them. About how they provided everything except the one thing I actually needed." His voice dropped lower. And suddenly, it was just him and her. Love. Eleanor felt something in her chest twist. But she held her ground. "James, we're at a party." James let out a short, humorless laugh. "Exactly. A party where you felt so comfortable humiliating the only person in this room who actually gave a damn about me before I had money." His voice hardened. "And that tells me everything I need to know about you." Eleanor's pulse quickened. She glanced around, realizing just how many eyes were on her now. Eyes that weren't admiring, they were waiting. But James wasn't finished. "You know what's funny?" He shook his head, chuckling to himself. "I always thought my biggest fear was ending up like my parents, too busy chasing success to notice the people who mattered." His jaw clenched. "Turns out, I married someone just like them instead." That landed. Eleanor's fingers twitched at her side. She had always prided herself on never losing composure. But this was public. "You're being ridiculous," Eleanor said. Her voice clipped. "I was just making an observation." James' eyes burned into her. "No, you were showing me who you really are." Eleanor's throat tightened. The air felt thick, too exposed. She needed to turn this back around, regain some ground. "Oh, come on, James. She was a nanny. You act like she was a mother when I didn't have one." His voice was firm, unshakable. "And you?" He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "You're a woman who thinks the only people worth respect are the ones with a bank account that matches yours." Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came. James nodded to himself, as if something inside him had just clicked. Then he turned back to Miss Ruth. "I should have done this a long time ago." Miss Ruth blinked up at him. "Baby, you don't have to." "I do," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I wouldn't be here without you." Then right there, in front of everyone, he did something no one expected. He took her hands, kissed them, and then he turned to the crowd. "I want you all to know something." His voice rang clear, cutting through the weight of the room. "This woman isn't just a guest tonight. She's the reason I have anything to give." People shifted, glancing at each other, unsure what to say. James continued. "She didn't just feed me. She didn't just watch me. She taught me right from wrong. She taught me how to be a man. She gave me the kind of love that money can't buy." His eyes flickered to Eleanor, the kind some people will never understand. Eleanor's breath came short now. This wasn't just about the gala anymore. This was personal. James turned back to Miss Ruth. "I know my parents paid you, but I also know they never really saw you. Not the way they should have." He swallowed. "But I do." Miss Ruth's lips pressed together, her hands trembling slightly in his. "You never asked me for a thing," James said softly. "But I'm giving you one anyway." Eleanor's stomach twisted. Before she even heard the words, "I've changed my will." The room gasped. Eleanor stilled. James continued, unfazed. "Miss Ruth, when I go, you won't have to worry about anything ever again." Eleanor's breath hitched. James turned to her now. His voice was colder. "You always assumed my money would stay in this marriage, that you'd be the one to decide where it goes." His jaw tightened. "But you assumed wrong." A sharp silence followed. Eleanor froze. James was cutting her out, right here, right now. Somewhere in the distance, someone dropped a glass. A soft shatter echoed across the room. The humiliation burned through Eleanor's skin. Her pulse pounded. This wasn't just some argument. This was destruction, her reputation, her marriage, her future, and worst of all, she could see it in his face. James wasn't bluffing. He meant every word, but the worst part? Victoria had just begun to realize she was losing more than just money. She was losing the one person who had ever truly cared. The gala was ruined. People weren't laughing. They weren't clinking glasses or posing for photographers anymore. They were watching her. Eleanor stood frozen, her mind racing, her skin prickling with heat. She had spent years curating her image, cementing herself as the queen of Houston's high society. And now, in a matter of minutes, she had become a spectacle. James turned away from her, his focus solely on Miss Ruth. "You deserve more than just words," he told her gently. "And I should have done this years ago." Miss Ruth swallowed hard, her eyes glassy. "Baby, I don't need." "It's not about need," James cut in, his voice firm but kind. "It's about what's right." The weight of his words settled in Eleanor's chest like a brick. This wasn't just a gesture, this was a message. She had spent years living under the assumption that no matter what, James would always choose her, that her status as his wife guaranteed her a certain level of protection, power, control. But now he was making it clear. She had mistaken his patience for permanence. Eleanor's nails dug into her palm. "James," she started, forcing her voice into something softer, something pleading. "Let's talk about this, privately." James turned to her, and the look in his eyes sent ice through her veins. "Now you want privacy." His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the sharp edge beneath it. Whispers swirled around them, small pockets of murmured shock rippling through the crowd. Eleanor scanned the faces in the room, searching for an ally, but no one met her eyes. The same people who had once fawned over her, who had waited on her approval, were suddenly indifferent, distant, and that was when she understood. Power in this world was not just about money, it was about influence, about the perception of control, and tonight, James had made sure she lost both. Her chest tightened. She needed to fix this. "Darling, you're upset." Eleanor tried, her voice honeyed, her hand reaching for his. "I didn't mean." James stepped back before she could touch him. Her fingers curled into a fist. He wasn't going to let her sweep this away, not this time. The weight of humiliation pressed against her ribs as the realization fully hit. She had pushed too far, and now she was paying for it. Miss Ruth placed a gentle hand on James' arm. "Baby, don't do anything out of anger." "This isn't anger," James said, his voice steady. "This is clarity." Eleanor's stomach dropped. This was it. The moment everything shifted. The moment she lost the man who had built the life she clung to so tightly. And the worst part, she had done this to herself. But Eleanor wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. And she wasn't going to let go without a fight. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her, The stares, the whispers, the slow unraveling of everything she had built. She could fix this. She had to. Straightening her shoulders, she forced a tight smile. "James, let's not be rash," she coaxed. "We've built a life together, our life. You can't seriously be thinking of—" James didn't even let her finish. "I'm done thinking, Eleanor." His voice was firm, cold. "I spent years making excuses for you. Years believing that underneath all of this—" He gestured vaguely at the glimmering room, the expensive gown, the carefully curated mask she wore. There was something real. His jaw tensed, but I was wrong. The room was silent. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears. "You're being dramatic," Eleanor whispered harshly, still trying to keep her voice light, controlled. "This is ridiculous. You're going to throw away everything we've built over her." James took a slow breath, and then he smiled. Not the warm, easy smile she had been used to, but something sharper. "I'm not throwing anything away," he said. "I'm just finally giving to the person who actually deserves it." Eleanor's throat tightened. Miss Ruth shook her head softly. "Baby, I don't want to be the reason for trouble." James turned to her, his expression softening. "You're not." "She is." Eleanor flinched. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled for a moment, then turned the screen toward her. A legal document, a revised will. Eleanor's breath caught. He had already done it. Her name was nowhere on the document. Her hands trembled as she looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "You're serious?" James held her gaze. "Completely," and with that, he turned to Miss Ruth, offering his arm. "Let's get you out of here." Miss Ruth hesitated, then she took it. Letting him guide her through the stunned crowd, the room parted for them, guests stepping aside. Whispers turning to quiet murmur. Eleanor stood frozen in place, alone, powerless. For the first time in her life, she had nothing left to hide behind. And as she watched James walk away, it hit her. She had won the marriage, but lost the man. Money can buy luxury, but it can't buy loyalty. The people who stand by you when you have nothing are the ones who truly matter. Treat them like they're disposable, and one day, you'll realize you're the one who's been left behind. Think about the people in your life who have stood by you even when they had nothing to gain. Have you truly appreciated them? Let this be a reminder. Wealth isn't about what's in your bank account. It's about the love, the respect, and the integrity you carry with you. Don't wait until it's too late to see who really matters.